I'm gonna write down that we're gonna do an episode. What if we're in a world where no one can tell what anyone's religious beliefs are?
Well, if you want to think about it, the ideal of a secular society is exactly that. If you're going to have some kind of a belief,
But
okay,
I'm saying more than that, though,
yeah,
because
I realize this, but
yeah.
in reality, from a practical point of view, when it's actually getting to the implementation of how people deal with each other, how the government is supposed to be dealing with the people, having everybody at the same length legally and politically, etc. That's exactly what we want.
Lots of people and really whole religions want to express what their religion is. Like, I don't know, in the Muslim way might be you wear the galabiya, the white galabiya or something.
Right.
And the Jewish way might be you wear that thingy, whatever it's
Yeah,
called.
but it goes
And the
beyond
Christian
that.
way, you got the cross right over here. You're clearly saying I'm this.
Yeah, but it goes beyond that because eventually you want to express some form of dominance in the society itself. Like, for example, when you look at Muslims and Christians, you have the Adhan declaring the prayer in a kind of a public way. The bells in a church is supposed to be tolling at specific times, and so there is a kind of
So, by the way, our review, if you're here, please let us know so you can come on.
yeah.
He's not
But
here yet.
so in any case, I think that that kind of public presence is really what's involved here, and in many cases, this is not something that's going to happen in a homogeneous society. It's mainly going to happen where there is some level of um, inhomogeneity, where you have different religious groups living in the same space, and probably one of them is going to be dominant. The other, at least if there's another big one, it's
So,
going to be
really,
one
you could
that's more.
say, man, I'm about to. So, if we're in a Muslim country, Muslim dominant country, and especially since there's the death penalty for leaving your religion, you really do have a scenario of you could look at somebody who they present as a Muslim, but maybe they're not. Right now, in a place of a lot of freedom, and let's say also not just freedom, but you don't get punished, you don't get socially outcast based on your religion, and so you feel freedom to expose what your real religious beliefs are, which in a lot of contexts in America it's like that. So then somebody who's wearing a cross, they really are a Christian. Somebody who's, and so on.
Yeah, maybe.
But I guess I'm saying one step further. Imagine we're in a world, let's say it's 1,000 years from now, and I don't know, let's say people don't really want to wear something that says what their religious beliefs are. And just to be clear, in America, I'm pretty sure there's lots of Christians who don't wear a cross. So they're not, right? They're just behaving the way they normally would, and you can't tell. And by their actions, you shouldn't be able to tell either. And by that I mean, like, good people are good people regardless of what their religious beliefs are. Now, maybe their religious beliefs can affect that, but I think the person's conscience is a lot stronger than whatever explicit beliefs they claim. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So let's let Anim on here. Hey, how you doing?
Hello.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Thank you for
now we can hear you.
Me.
But by the way, would you prefer Anam or a review, or what is it that you'd
testing
like?
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, no, we can hear you.
We hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, so Samuel was saying, would you prefer us to call you Anim or I review? I guess Anim.
My name should be fine.
Yeah. Okay. So we're here to talk about, and this was, I guess it was my idea to talk about it today, but no, it was your idea. You wanted to talk about the history of Islamic expansion. You hear me? Uh-oh, he's not hearing us.
Sorry.
Okay.
One sec, my own audio. Okay, yes, now we're good. Yeah, so we were going to talk about the Islamic conquest, but I think like Osama was mentioning like the badges of superiority that we have in society. So like you said, like a Christian who wears like a big cross necklace, very aggressively, or like the call to prayer or the ringing of a bell. That's like assertion of like your cultural dominance. I thought that was like a good segue into like the idea of conquest and domination.
Well, you mentioned conquest. Islam expanded. I do agree in some cases with conquest. In some cases it wasn't conquest. So
right.
So we just neutrally called it expansion. How did Islam expand?
There are regions in I believe in Southeast Asia where there was a lot of commerce that's involved that had nothing really to do with.
Let's start from the beginning for people, though, since we're calling it the history. The beginning would be it was just Muhammad. How did the second person hear about it? That's where we should start. How did the second person hear about Islam?
No, you're right. You're actually just you're the host of the show. I don't want to challenge you, but I think Osama's point though. Before we get to the end of the history, though, I remember in a college class I took, no Muslim army ever set foot in Indonesia. It was entirely done through trade, and in fact, it was through the excellent character of the Muslim traders. Like they wouldn't cheat you, like because it's very easy to cheat somebody in a
that's something that I also heard when we were growing up, but I don't necessarily think that this is the main explanation. The mere fact that you have some kind of a trading group, and that if this group is already dominating a certain territory, they're able to have access to a lot of the resources, and they're controlling that. It makes sense that at some point you're going to have a lot of converts to gain advantage in trading with the other people. I'm not sure about the moral character. It's a little bit of a judgment that goes beyond what you can say historically, but I definitely would, as far as I know, again, it might be different, but from what I learned as well.
Let me throw in another wrench.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Let me throw in another wrench. Whatever we think Islam is today, and there's many versions. There's also, we can see it as 1400 years ago. It's yet another version that we're not very well aware of. So whatever people were hearing about what Islam is might be a lot more palatable today, or at least you can say it this way: the culture back then found it more palatable.
Yeah,
they're comparing it to other things that were already there.
Yeah.
And again, this is 1400 years ago, and I guess we're talking about like Saudi Arabia,
I think if you really go all the way back to the beginning, we're looking at murky history that we don't really know enough about.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about who the second person is, we don't really know.
The Second Empire.
According to what we've heard, I mean.
Well, let me actually say something. For example, at the beginning, when you look at the very first supposed surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Alaq, it's talking about how the first revelation took place, which basically it can be considered to be a conceptual start for the Quran. There is an almost exact story that was propagating in England, of all places, that was talking about a person who had a kind of a vision, and the vision was asking him to read and so on. So that kind of history seems to have been in the air. This is not in the Quran itself. We have the revelation in the form of a surah in the Quran, but we don't actually know the background. And so what I'm saying here is that the actual background that is usually very common, and something that we learn about in school, we think that this is history. This is basically, all of it is something that can be considered as something that formed after the fact. It's not something that we can actually say this is rooted in history, that we have something attested, and we can say, yeah, this is actually how it happened. So when you
I
go
agree.
back all the way to the beginning like this, we don't really know anything. As
I
far
agree.
as I'm concerned,
There's a lot of backward projection like
yeah,
going on.
yeah.
And you
Go
see
ahead.
this, sorry, very briefly, the Sunni and Shia, they'll take the same tafsir of where a verse was revealed, and they'll have completely different like takes
Oh, yeah.
on like how and when. And so in other words, like like you said, even the first surah Al-Alaq, like when you read it literally, you can take it for what it literally is, but was it like revealed with that story in the cave?
Yeah,
It could have been a fragment that just became that's a great place where you're going to come up with the cave story. I agree.
yeah. Even if you want to make a direct connection between the story itself and what the actual Quranic text is saying, you cannot really. If
No.
you read the Quranic text, you have absolutely no way of guessing, oh, this is the context, or that even if you look at the Quran and look at how the concept of angels is developed there, you don't even hear the word angel until much later. There is a portion that is clearly added to the Surah Al-Alaq that came much later, that has nothing to do with the original form. But the word angel, malak, and then even the word Jibril, which is supposed to be, it's not something that appears until much later, and even the mentions of the Quran are in completely different contexts that have nothing to do with the revelation. So who the second person is, who knows?
Okay, so
You're
far
right.
it looks like we're just been giving disclaimers.
Yeah.
Where should we actually get started then? If we don't know the first person after Muhammad, then how about the first wave? The first wave
Right.
outside of Medina or Mecca. So like, what happened in Mecca? Was there? How did Islam spread in Mecca? Let's start with that then.
So I'm glad we're going with this still, but because you guys are both native Arabs, right? Because I wasn't.
My parents are from Syria. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I there's this Angelica Neuwirth, there's a German scholar, and again, Rami, I don't want to be rude to you as a host because I'm deflecting away from your question again. But something I think this is like something very shocking that I realized, and it's so true. But so she's a German scholar of Islam, and she's one of the best translators of Arabic, medieval Arabic. And so she's at the Lebanese American University, and she's giving a lecture that I really loved. And she mentions how the Arabs are the only people to write themselves out of history, because when you look at their history began with Islam, and therefore before that they were just a bunch of desert tribes, Bedouin tribes, and they weren't doing anything, and they had no contribution to civilization, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Like in the 5th century, Yemen was called Felix Arabia because they had a massive reservoir system and they were incredibly prosperous. Also the Arabs of Damascus, even in the New Testament days, like they're all the way up and down trading, and even during the Byzantine days, we mentioned the Lakhmanid and the Ghaznavid. They were like buffer states before the desert Arabs would be able to go into the Syria, Iraq, Palestine area. So it's kind of amazing though.
Never thought about that.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, right? Because
it's the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, not the
Thank you.
Ghaznavids. That's India.
Yeah, that's true. And then I say Ghaz, I said Ghazan is, so yeah, I confused.
Or Ghassanids. Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah. No, true. And then, but one of them, so here's the interesting thing. So I mentioned this last time, when I talked about the Byzantines. So the Near East, it's very interesting how like the Arab like race or ethnicity even becomes into Syria, because, okay, so in the New Testament, 1st century, when you use the word Arabia, it could mean the Sinai, it could mean Jordan, because they're living in Israel, Palestine. So when you say Arabia, you mean like Sinai or something. And then it could also mean Syria, like a Damascus, and then it means the peninsula of Arabia as well. So there's like 7. When you say Arabia, there's like 7 different senses in which you refer to Arabia, and so therefore the Arabs are prominent in history. They have numerous the Nabateans are trading. The Nabateans have an alphabet. The Nabateans are connecting Afghanistan to Rome, basically, with the Silk trade. And then when Islam comes, all of a sudden, we kind of act, well, the Arabs themselves, I'm an Indian. So the Arabs themselves kind of say like, okay, this man, I even put this in your chat once, but the Prophet basically gave us civilization, and that's how Muslims do look at it, but frankly, like these were people who were part of history and had notable contributions, and yet they're the only people who wrote themselves out of history this way. It's kind of crazy.
Well, yeah, maybe my perspective
There's
is
probably others, but go on.
well, my perspective when the word Arab is mentioned is not really a kind of a well-defined thing prior to really much later. Even when we're talking about the people who accompanied Muhammad or who were the first wave that came out of Arabia, they did not even call themselves Arabs. And they were not going into a place that called themselves Arabs. So the Arabic as a language was there, but it wasn't the main language that was spoken in those areas. And in fact, it wasn't even formalized until the Quran was written and people started codifying it. And it was written under the influence of Syriac and Nabateans. And so the script that we have and the lettering and everything that came from that came about afterwards. And so the identity that we had prior to Islam was not a really well-formed identity. And so one of
You
the
could say Islam was made to make that identity, and a lot of countries did this. A lot of peoples did this.
Yeah, but there is something that's very important in the Quran itself that you can actually see repeated so many different times, where it presents itself as an Arabic Quran, Quran Arabi Mubin, Quran bilisan Arabi Mubin, something that is
clear,
specifically for Arabs. And my understanding of what was actually happening was that there is some kind of an environment where the scriptures of the Jews and the Christians is available in Arabia, that there is a kind of a need, a yearning for something indigenous. And so when we're talking about Quran Arabi Mubin, that's basically what it is. So you can think of the Quran in that sense as a way of reimagining that scripture that was already available there. So you can already see that so many different stories that you have in the Bible, especially we're talking here about the Hebrew Bible, gets appearing again in the Quran. And in fact, the most common or the most prevailing character in the Quran is actually the character of Moses. He's mentioned about 130, 140 times in the text of the Quran. And so there is definitely a wave or a tendency for whoever was writing the Quran to get close to that tradition, but at the same time to keep a kind of a distance. Because if you notice, when they're starting to talk about Arabs as a kind of a medium, a linguistic medium, they don't jump directly, yes, we're descendants of Moses from a religious point of view. They start talking about descendants from Abraham, which basically cuts off that kind of descent line and creates descent line that comes through Ishmael instead of Isaac. And so it's possible to then give some root, even though Ishmael was really so far up north, has nothing to do with Arabia itself. They ended up creating this kind of connection. And so the Arab identity can be thought of as something that formed along with Islam in that sense. And that's why I'm a little bit reticent to say that there was a kind of an Arab civilization, if you will, before Islam. There were definitely places like you mentioned, Yemen, like the Nabateans. But if you actually look at the historical record, you will see that the Yemenis don't actually refer to the people north of them the way that they refer to themselves. They would talk about them as Arabs. They're not including themselves
Yeah,
in
that's
that
that's
identity.
so. Let me clarify for everybody. Here's what we're talking about, and this happened in every part of the world. Take any area that today we see as like one unit or one country or one people, one culture or whatever. At some point in the past, it was many different ones that got unified. And really,
Right.
it means all the other ones got deleted or absorbed, but sort of deleted.
Yeah.
So,
Subsumed.
like, if you take France, for example, today,
Yeah.
everyone in France, if you ask everyone in France, what are you? They'll probably say they're French. But if you go back like 500 years, there was probably 1,000 different things they would call
Kingdoms.
themselves.
Oh,
in the area.
there's an even closer example, not just France. If you look at Germany, Germany was not really formed as Germany until
1850.
yeah, yeah,
Otto von Bismarck.
exactly.
It was hundreds of princely kingdoms.
Exactly.
Like, there's no country called Germany.
Yeah, Italy also to a lesser extent, but Germany in particular, Germany did not really form until
There was never a country called Germany.
And I guess I'll point out that in every one of these cases, and I'm not a historian, I haven't looked at all of them, but every one that I've seen, this unifying effect was done by physical force, a sword.
Yeah, my example would
The
be
ass of the other guys and saying, "Now I'm the king."
Yeah, my example would be on the same note. It's the UK. You know, what's crazy is that England is this like small country, and it takes over Wales and it takes over Scotland, and it takes a lot of beating up the Scots, and then it starts dominating Ireland. Even till 20th century, you know, they would make the Irish lick their boots. You know, like shoot them just for like.
And some of them are still trying to get out.
Yeah. Right,
and a lot of the countries label that organization a terrorist organization.
Right. So Northern Ireland is still a hot point, you know, like but my point is though, look, these like once England conquered the barbarians of the Scots, you know, all the way in the Northern Highlands, they exploded into conquering India, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East, you know, all these like
started with the islands next to them, and then they went outside.
Right. They united, but
I think it's unfair to call them barbarians. May I ask
they
why
were
you used that word?
No, well, because they would call us barbarians. So, you know, that's why I'm just looking at them the same way. It's like when you take all these disparate enemy tribes, you know, and then you forge them into like this amazing, and you take all the energy that you had fighting each other and you point that outwards instead, which is what, you know, the Prophet
that actually connects nicely with what we're talking about, because if you look at all these maybe we can think about this idea of the barbarians when it comes to the Roman Empire, because
that's
obviously
where the term started, I think.
Yeah. And it had to do with the actual language as a language that they
didn't understand.
Well, from what I understand, barbarian was a term used for anyone who wasn't Roman or Greek. So they were treating the Greeks as us,
them,
and everyone else is them.
Civilized, because they borrowed Greek
civilization. Barbarian meant savage,
right?
Uncivilized. Hey, you're not worth. I don't know. You're not worth. Well, running your own place. We have to civilize you.
Right. But what my point was that by the time Rome fell, we're talking about the actual fall of Rome,
425,
300, 400, something like that.
Yeah.
What you ended up actually with the people who came into the city, even though they were labeled barbarians, they had already been indoctrinated and looking like actual Romans, so that when they came in, it wasn't exactly a kind of an invasion as such. It was mainly I'm not sure how to qualify it, but it wasn't really that kind of dramatic event that might be portrayed as the end of the Roman civilization as such.
Yeah, the Roman Empire was very effective at taking over a place and converting their infrastructure, their government infrastructure, into the Roman way.
Right. Yeah. And so that what I wanted here for our idea is to connect it with the Arabs themselves, because many of the Arabs in the region were already also working with the Romans. They were agents, what they called the foderati, where you had these tribes that are working together, basically as agents of Rome. And so, from the perspective of Rome, you had these present right at the time when Rome was becoming so weak internally because of various economic things. There was a famine that preceded that. There was war with the Persians. There was also a plague that
Corruption.
preceded that, the Justinian plague that was not long before that. And so
Barbarian invasions, but yeah.
But the whole point here that I'm trying to get across is that you had a kind of a situation where um, the Arabs themselves were already qualified to wage war in connection with Rome, but at the same time, they're viewing Rome as a kind of a corpse that is collapsing, and had that kind of opportunity to start expanding an empire building based on that. So the whole thing is a kind of a background for the burgeoning religion of Islam, which was mixing that tribalism that initially was talking about, or that was concerning the internal conflicts that you had in the peninsula, but then they always had their eye outside because of that collapse that's taking place both in the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire at the same time.
Yeah, 100%, I agree.
There was 3 major empires worried about each other, and I'm not talking about the Far East, because this is at a time where you can't move very far, so you're just fighting the next door neighbor. Well, the 3 neighbors, from what I understand, the big ones is the Roman Empire, which is a little bit was older, the Persian Empire, and the Arab Islamic Empire. And I think the Persian Empire is older. So the Islamic Empire was the new one to the stage. And the Roman Empire was already dying.
Well, both the Romans and the Persians were basically dying by that time, because
they had weakened each other by constantly.
There were wars constantly throughout.
But Iraq was like their battleground. Like one year Rome would take it, and then one year Persia would take it. I actually, I'm in New York, so we have a wonderful museum called the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. They uncovered a 2 square kilometer. This is how small this area is. In this 2 square kilometer area by the Iraq Euphrates River, they found more than a dozen religious sites of worship, including Roman and Persian shrines. Because, if you're pagan, you can worship at the sun god place. Like it's not fancy, right? Like whether you call him, Kamash, or whether you call him Sol, you're still gonna go and worship at that shrine. But they found a synagogue with like a niche towards Jerusalem, and they found churches too. And this is before Islam. It was the year 300. So in other words, the religious diversity and the pluralism, like even if the government changed, the people were very much still like Mithraism and all these different things. But it's absolutely amazing to see how much people were very diverse, considering how.
Remind me again when the Roman Empire, and I guess a particular emperor, decided we're going to go with one religion now.
I think Constantine was 310. So we want to say
still before Islam.
Yeah.
Right.
About 300 years roughly.
I mean, that gives some context, because before this, I was just saying earlier, the Roman Empire was good at, I shouldn't say good at, effective at, I don't want to make a moral claim. Effective at converting a place to its own government structure and not caring about the religious.
Well, it's not that they didn't care about the religion. What they were good at is absorbing that religion in such a way that you bring in that new religion and the new people who follow that religion, and you subsume it inside the Roman system. And the Roman system basically cared mainly only about having you to pay taxes or homage to the government. As long as that's done, you
And
can.
to not like tell all your people to take over our country. That's what I meant by having. They were effective at installing a government structure that was compatible with any religions, as long as the religion stayed in its lane, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Up until 300.
Yeah, you basically when you're paying homage to the emperor, you're also
Right.
creating some kind of a religious allegiance, and that's why
Right.
the Romans had a big issue with the Jews. The
Right.
Jews had
They were weird.
yeah, because the Jews would not consider the emperor as divine in the same sense, because they're saying, okay, we're worshiping one God, and as a result of that,
and then Christians had that problem too. They carried it over. Like, you're supposed to light a stick of incense for the emperor. So when Christians had mass, you're doing the whole priest doing the reenaction of the crucifixion. And because they refused to light, all you have to do is light a stick of incense for the emperor during your religious ritual. They're not asking for much, but because that itself is like a religious offering, they refused to do it. And the Catholic Church was persecuted. But yeah, I mean, so Christians inherited that. And that's the, and sorry, there's this Jewish story. Why are so many Jews named Alexander? When Alexander the Great conquered Palestine, he said that you should put a statue of me in the Jewish temple. And all the Jewish leaders are like, that's really not going to work, because, we have problems. That's when we start having, rebellions. So they say, how about this? All the boys that are born this year, we'll name them all Alexander. And he says, that's a great idea. I love it.
Wow. That's a nice compromise. I mean, I say a nice compromise like it's righteous or something.
Yeah, no, it flatters the guy's ego without making you do a sacrilege at the temple,
Yeah, but it can have its own negative effects.
Alexander's a nice
what
name.
What does it mean to people when all your sons are called Alexander?
Right.
Yeah.
When you're that, I don't know what that did to people or how it changed things.
You don't think?
But yeah, maybe it was a more benign scenario.
One thing I wanted to say about you, Rami, the reason I like your show, even though, technically I'm a Muslim and I'm still very attached to Islam and the Quran, you do something that even most, atheists coming from Christianity and agnostics don't do. What you really have to do is, when you replace a religion or a philosophy or a thought system, you have to see what it was doing and like reverse engineer it, and then you can have a replacement. But you can't just like put a vacuum in people's spiritual lives, and that's not going to work. So what I always see in your head, when you're doing the class and you and Osama are trying to figure out like, what are we going to put in the syllabus? It's like atheists are, if I mean, I'm not technically on your side, but if the future is away from religion, like Freud predicted and stuff, like this is just a figment from the past and people are not going to have this illusion anymore, you're going to have to and I think, non-denominational Christianity tries to do this very badly, by the way, because it just becomes like a Sunday self-help class. But you are going to have to motivate people. It's going to sound a little bit, like a self-help thing. But, in other words, I see you're applying yourself. I don't know if like,
I like the way you described it. I could say it even shorter for you. Everything that we do, every idea, and the way I see a religion as a set of ideas, a unit. It was trying to serve a purpose, and replacing the set of ideas, well, you need to consider the purpose that they were solving, and some of it you still want to do. So even if I think the idea is wrong, the purpose for it was good. So I need a new idea with the same purpose. And maybe some of the purposes was off too, but some of it is still good. That's why I say, you can't leave a religion and say everything about the religion was wrong. There's no such religion like that. The religion never would have got off the ground.
No.
Yeah. Let me add something to it, because when you look at any kind of religion has definitely played a very important organizing role throughout history. And what we're going through right now, whether it's in the Muslim world or outside, is a diminishing of the role of religion, and this definitely is creating a vacuum. But that vacuum, if we want to fill it, we have to really, like you said, you look at the role that the religion is playing and see what it's actually doing. Because if what we're claiming is right, if religion is a human institution and it's not really something that's divinely inspired, then this means it's possible to disentangle what the religion is doing from the rituals, from the beliefs, and to present it in a way that would be suitable for humans without needing to engage in those religious aspects. That doesn't mean that someone who wants to be religious, you say no, you can't do that. Well, everybody can do whatever they want. What I'm saying is that it's now possible to create that kind of disentanglement, to present a system that can live on its own without really having that historical baggage, which is not easy to get rid of. It's definitely not easy to come and say we're going to rebuild. What does that even mean? Because if you look at the impression that people have of atheism is a nihilism. Atheism is a destructive idea, and all it does is
amorality.
Exactly. And so that's the whole point of really trying to think about what actually comes next. People, I've heard, and I've known many people in my life who would say, all I'm doing as an atheist is saying I'm not going to be believing in God. Well, that's not enough. If you're going to be actually presenting something beyond what you see right now, you have to create some form of a path that, like you said, is not going to plunge people into a void. You have to look at that vacuum that's going to be created, and then see how you're going to be proceeding.
You know, one thing I'll say about religious people, or the motivation to be religious, let's say it that way. I think people's motivation is, and I think this is the primary thing, maybe if not for most people, everybody, you're trying to be good. You're trying to be a good person. And I think there are people who are atheists who aren't trying to do that. Now, maybe you could say the same thing about some people who believe in a religion, but that category of people, that last category, people who are already in a religion, some people are born to it. So that's not the same thing as the category of people, somebody wanting to become religious, and let's say didn't start that way, or had a very shaky religious family and then tried to be religious. Am I making sense?
Yeah, but I think I would disagree about the proportion of people in general, because the people who are really born into religion make up the majority of people. You inherit your religion as part of the cultural package that you get from your family, from your environment, and then beyond that, you can use your religion in whatever way depending on the environment. If your environment has diversity, where there is a kind of a contrast, then your religion is going to probably play a bigger part than if you had a homogeneous environment.
At least the way you understand that religion.
Yeah,
which is another element.
And so if the environment turns out to be homogeneous, basically religion drops out of the equation in a certain sense, because if everybody is supposed to be religious, you look at a big majority Muslim countries or big majority Christian countries, religion becomes a kind of a ritual, a kind of a social thing, because everybody is expected to behave the same way. It's only when you have that kind of contrast that it becomes more important to emphasize or use religion in a specific way, where it might be a force for good or not.
So I wonder if we've deviated. So does this current subtopic, does it relate back to the Islamic expansion?
I think what I was doing, I was complimenting you guys for being such insightful atheists.
Well, maybe it can.
Yeah. Because, honestly, I think sometimes most atheists, I mean, this is, they're licking their wounds. Like, okay, maybe the church or the mosque traumatized them. The madrasa, they got hit on the hand too much, or or maybe like whatever is their experience. And then, like you said, that their default position is, I don't want anything to do with this. And one thing, so I have a degree, not to brag, but it's a bachelor's degree in comparative religion. And one thing, just maybe if we were going to pivot back, is that syncretism is like a real thing. And also, for example, the spread of Christianity in Europe, people love to think that it's really, when you convert to a new religion, it's out with the old and in with the new. But it's more like there was this crazy fusion that happened. And like when you look at how Christmas is connected to like winter pagan festivals, it makes sense, right? Like if it's the dead cold of winter and I bring you a hot pie, and like that, like as a society, that kind of giving is probably a good idea, So like maybe wintertime is a great time to give each other like presents, just because we all survive, when there's no leaves outside. So I feel like so there's always this mixing. So Islam does that. Islam also, by the way, as an Indian Muslim, I used to think like, Islam was a pure thing, like it was just transmitted to us, from the Arabs. And then like later you realize like, we're really an outpost of Persian civilization. And we use Persian script, we use Persian words for namaz, not salah. So in fact, it's but every country has its own experience of Islam as well. It's kind of like shocking when you're told that like you're being taught like God's singular truth, like
and then
there's
you
no
can drill
deviation
down to a family and then an individual within the family.
Yeah,
I don't think I don't think two people had the exact same experience.
No. No, but sorry, the point was about syncretism, right? So even the Islam that infiltrated into Damascus and Iraq, and Iran and Turkey. So it's very interesting to see how but we were talking about Roman emperors. 2 Roman emperors were from Syria, by the way. So like when you were saying they were very good at like running the administration and just like letting people just run their like basically they were letting the governors do the hard part of like collecting taxes and like putting your foot down.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a historian I listen to, Casagranda. I forgot his first name. Roy Casagranda. That's what it is. He speaks very highly of the Arab Islamic Empire.
Conquerors. Yeah.
And one of the things he said about it was that when the Muslims would take over a place, they wouldn't upset their government and just let them keep running it the way they've been running it. Now, to me, that sounds very hands-off. I'm guessing the Roman Empire wasn't hands-off like that. It was like the Roman Empire was successful at installing its government, but and I think in some way it was hands-off. Like what you just described is a bit of a hands-off method. Don't disrupt the current governor, right, whoever's there now. Right. I don't think I'm guessing they didn't do it that way. The Romans. I think the Romans was. I mean. And this is not, again, I'm not a historian. What I saw was stuff like the Romans would take over a place and then do things like go to every little town, not kidnap, but force them to give up some of their kids, go train their kids for decades over in Rome, and then send them back to run the place. So it was make them Roman, where it seems like the Islamic way wasn't that. Right. I don't really know. Again,
I would like maybe to nuance this a little bit, because I don't think you can actually paint the entire period of either the Muslims or the Romans with one brush, or even within the same era,
but different places.
Yeah, and that actually connects a little bit to what we were talking about last time when we were considering how some of the Muslims at the beginning behaved in India versus how this progressed afterwards. Because at the beginning there was basically raids, and then after that there were practicalities of the situation that were realized, and it wasn't as aggressive as the beginning. So yeah, it's possible to say that there was a kind of a character to how some of the Muslims behaved in certain areas, but you cannot really generalize it to say this was all bad or all good, because first of all, it was different people who were different doing this, and they
Right.
were also encountering different people when they're going in. So you need to also take into account the character of the
Resistance.
population. So for example, in Egypt, it took a very long time to quell rebellions that happened after the Muslim conquest.
Oh, really?
You had at the beginning the conquest itself, and then there were continuous rebellions that continued for I don't want to say 100 200 years. I'm not sure about the dates
That
right
would
there.
make sense, though. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Because, like, for example, the people of North Africa who are there were people in Africa who were non-Arabized. So, one thing the Arabs did was they Arabized, like, like a ton of people, like from north, south, east, west, like the Sudanese and so on. But then in North Africa, though, there's the Tuareg people. That tribe, they don't know, like, their Arabic is nothing like Arabic. They don't call themselves, they don't speak, like, they are from, it's kind of crazy to think about. Everybody around you has picked up this language, and you still somehow, like, become a bastion of your own tradition. But but you're right, most of them folded. But you can imagine, though, there were people like the Tuareg who but also, like, for example, we see in any regime, right, we might think of someone as a dictatorship, but there's a whole business class, a merchant class, a general class. There's, like, all kinds of people who still run a lot of interests, even if, like, you topple the leadership.
A lot of times by getting favors, being nice to the dictator and getting favors from the dictator.
Right.
And I think that's something that happens everywhere at all times, even today, even in the US. I wonder if there's countries that don't do it, where it doesn't happen.
You also need to take into account that when the biggest expansion happened, we're talking about a huge swath of land that was included in the dominion of the Muslims, and the presence of the Muslims in these new regions was basically confined to garrisons, to small areas. You cannot, just because of the sheer numbers,
Yeah.
you cannot actually say, okay, all of a sudden these regions turned into Muslims and everybody was speaking
Right.
Arabic all of a sudden. So you had this kind of,
That's the biggest fiction.
yeah, it's a kind of a separation of the ruling class, which was for the most part maintained for a long time as being Arab, and then after that, for various reasons, you have the servants, the people who are working in the garrison. You start having some intermixing. So that you do end up with a mixed population. But at the beginning, you have to take into account that no matter how numerous the Arabs were, because of how fast the expansion happened, they still were far fewer than the actual population.
Yeah, like maybe the Arabs was in some areas was only 10% of the people.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
So
right.
90% of other things. And they didn't try to force them all to Islam, as far as I know.
And like Osama said, they lived on the outside city. And you mentioned this before, Rami. The idea of Islam was different because the most shocking thing you'll see, the earliest Muslim currency that we have is the Caliph Abdul Malik, and we think it's his picture on the coin. And so that means Islam wasn't iconoclastic when you had the first empire. Like the first proven. And so so the idea is they copied Byzantine coins because you put the Byzantine Empire. Oh yeah. And so and you can't actually tell who the guy is. He just has like crazy hair, So
well, it's even worse than that because of the fact that they reused the same mint. They ended up with crosses on some of the coins, which meant for some people, and that goes back to Muawiyah, the very first caliph outside of Arabia. That he was actually Christian, and there are actual theories that consider him to be a Christian, which I don't know. There might be something to it based on his lineage in the Sirah, but probably, at least my guess from someone who's looking at this from the outside, is that there was already some minting facilities that were already doing some minting with a specific shape for the coin, and so you have that practicality, but you also need to maintain the credibility of that coin. If you're using that to trade with people, you have to show them something that they're familiar with. If you now bring something new, they might not recognize this, and they would say, I don't know. But that's my guess.
And certainly, if it was a majority Christian population, it would make preeminent sense to keep those crosses. Or
Yeah.
even if it's accidental, you'll just like leave it because like it's for them anyway.
Yeah. Copts in Egypt persisted for a very, very long time as the majority. People would say, well, Egypt became Muslim. Well, no, if you actually look at the history, you will see that so many of the people persisted as Christians for a very, very long time. It's not practical to just go in and conquer a place and say, okay, everybody's going to be changing who they're going to be believing for all of a sudden. So it doesn't work that way. Even though when you look at, for example, the early history in small tribes around Medina and Mecca, when they say, okay, we're now going to be signing a treaty with Muhammad, we're going to follow our leader, and they follow the chief of the tribe, and they all change allegiance. But at the same time, when you look at the moment that Muhammad died, many of them rescinded that, and they said, okay, we're not going to recognize this anymore. We had allegiance to Muhammad specifically. We're not going to be recognized the authority of Abu Bakr, and they had a big rebellion that was called the Apostasy Wars and so on.
Ridda, right?
Yeah.
And but Islam would not have survived if Abu Bakr hadn't nipped a lot of things in the bud.
Yeah. I think that kind of war, which was very much related to zakat in a lot of places, paying alms.
Right.
And,
that was weird to them.
Yeah. If you don't pay that, then that's going to be challenging the authority of the central government in Medina. And if you rebel against that, then that's basically going to cause the whole thing to crumble down.
I like how you said Medina, because the power center does shift to Medina, but there's something very interesting. Because I read something very interesting, by Montgomery Watt. He wrote a 2-volume biography of the Prophet in 1954. So, we're talking like, very, very top-notch Oriental scholarship. And so, the Prophet, it's very, because, Rami, it's a circle back to what you said at the beginning, who's the second person, and at some point this religion shifts its focus. But yeah, Medina definitely, but so the thing is, though, the Prophet could have just ruled out of Medina, but he really wanted the Quraysh because their leadership and their business acumen, and I think, like, I don't know how else to say it, but like their sharpness, like I think that the word Quraysh means shark in a way, so like they were kind of like sharks, like I guess to say like war is no joke, right? Like tricking the enemy.
Well,
and
let me actually just make a small correction about that, because the word shark, as far as I know, derives from a slightly different form, and it comes from Greek, not from Arabic. And the word Quraysh itself seems to be related to a Syriac origin, which has, according to some interpretations, related to a kind of a federation. And so that I've heard about one interpretation that tries to identify the Quraysh with the way that the tribes were actually federated under the Romans. But in any case, this is a kind of a theory.
No, that's cool. Sure. So actually, to bounce back to what you were saying, because we have to, like when you look at the book itself, because like you said, one thing is, these origins are a mystery shrouded in an enigma, right? Because we have this text. The text itself doesn't tell you anything about an angel shaking him until he recites 3 times. So it's something like you can clearly tell is superimposed. And then you were talking about how it calls itself a clear Arabic Quran, And the opposite of the Arabic is the Ajami, which is the foreign. And I learned, the foreign means Aramaic or Syriac, right? I mean, like, this is like there's like West Syriac and East Syriac, and my head doesn't really work, like, because I'm just trying to figure out, like for me, Syriac is Syriac, but apparently one doesn't go back to like Jesus's language. There's like a gap of like 500-600 years. Anyway, so the thing is that but Aramaic is so ubiquitous in the Near East. Like, in other words, Hebrew is like Jews in Israel don't speak Hebrew. They speak Aramaic. This is how, like, Aramaic, which is an Aramean tongue, like the Akkadian, and between Akkadian and Canaanite is Aramean. So like that, the you could say like the Jordan Iraq border, I guess, that would be like where these tribes came from. But this language somehow becomes the lingua franca. And then Greek, I really like how you mentioned Greek being the root origin of the shark, because I just made a note before, and then I'll pause. But when we noted like Arabic didn't have a script. It could have been using a Syriac script or a Nabatean script. Like the script is a Nabatean script, basically. But we have proof, right, before Islamic era, 5th century, 4th century, 6th century, the Arabic was written in Greek. So we could have had a history, like alternate future, where like we just decided to run with Greek letters to write Arabic, because they're just picking up whatever letters from the cultures around them, and it doesn't make a difference to them either way. And of course, if
let me throw something onto this. So I learned a basic thing from Roy Casagrande, the historian. Actually, I'm not exactly sure if his background is historian. What he says is, what different people of different fields of study, when they look back into history of like what started things, what starts a civilization, they each kind of take an angle from their own field. And he said he thinks the correct way is
interdisciplinary.
I'm up what I'm describing here, but the reason writing started, the reason anyone wanted to do any writing, was to record the trade that was happening. So before trade, no need for writing yet. So I'm trying to connect this with what you just said, Adam.
Right. If you owe me $5, I'll just say you owe me $5. We don't have to write it down. Like I'll remember that.
Well,
but
there's too many,
right? Until there's like 200 cows.
Record. I bought this many from this guy. So you're already developing a script. And before there was a script, there was, what's the Egyptian system? The
hieroglyphics.
Hieroglyphics. You just had a picture of the thing that you're selling, and then you develop numerals and then an alphabet.
Right.
So I'm trying to connect that with what you just said about the Arabs using which script before, like they had a script, I'm guessing, before the Greeks.
They use everything from and if you look at, for example, so if you look at the inscriptions that are available in Arabia from the time of the rise of Islam, there is one particular script that stands out called Safayitic script.
Right.
And this is basically found on rock in rock inscriptions. And this was actually one of the scripts that led eventually to the development of what we today call Arabic. But there was a lot of influence from Nabatean, and Nabatean connects to what you were saying, Rami, because the Nabateans were big traders. They were basically running the trade in the entire region. And even with the Nabateans, if you look at their language, they also have a mixture. They spoke Aramaic. They had their script, which was basically a form of Arabic. And so they were basically bilingual.
Yeah, you could guess the letters pretty easily. Sorry, I don't mean to speak
and so with Arabic, when they wanted to write down the Quran, because I think writing the Quran was the main motivation in order to move this forward. They had to come up with a script, and I think part of the motivation of using a script that's derived from the Nabateans and that's affected by the Syriac is that the people who eventually were qualified enough to do this were actually Christian scribes who were already well versed in Syriac, that were able to take the language across that threshold and start creating a well unified language. So if you take a look at the most ancient
You're right. And a unified script
yeah, if
Yeah.
you look at the Quran in the most
and a
ancient
unified theology.
forms, you will see that it actually looks strikingly like Syriac. You look at it. I mean, if you
It's true.
work hard, you're able to read, but it looks different.
No, you're right. The read of the pen and everything. You're right.
Yeah, yeah.
So you
yeah,
know what we
it's,
didn't talk about? We talked about history of Islamic expansion,
And
and
pre-Islam.
was talking about conquest right from the beginning, but plenty of it wasn't conquest. And you could say Islam is expanding plenty today also. People talk about it a lot, you know, in the West, in America, in the UK, and a lot of other countries. It's growing in these places. That's a type of expansion. Would you guys, you know what I mean? It's a type of expansion, which we didn't discuss at all.
right.
And we don't have any more
I
time.
mean,
'cause we've
I
used
feel
up
like
the
there's
whole
an
time.
exhaustion also, though. I feel like there's a contraction. Like, I think, this is just a guess. I didn't watch this video, but somebody, you can see, I think this is maybe your show, right? You can see the religiosity by like how much lights are on during the iftar time or something. So, and it's gone anyway. Sorry, but what I feel like, the thing is, my thing, right? I'll tell you from my perspective, because I'm turning 40 this year. Okay, so I'm still young, but I grew up, witnessing some very tumultuous events in the Middle East. 2003 Iraq War was my high school days. So, I feel like after after the failure of Arab nationalism, Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1967, the Islamism was like I don't want to say fad, but for lack of a better term, it became a fad. Because once you say Islam is the solution, it's very easy to like capture someone's imagination. Like, I mean, this is a uniting thing at the end of the day. Thank you. So, so the thing is, then the thing is though, once you see the destruction I was very fundamentalist myself in my teens. So if in my own country, like I'm from India, but when you see in Pakistan, for example, like a shrine being blown up by like fundamentalists, it's like Muslims who suffer the most from like acts of terrorism. And it's one to say like, okay, like, we're bringing down occupation or we're bringing down, colonialism, but like your own society is being ripped apart by this like disease, this ideological menace of like extremism. It's very painful, So I feel like, from a
trying to destroy the other parts of that culture, which some of it is older than Islam, some of it still exists. Yeah, I don't think it's good.
Yeah, so I feel like there's a fatigue there, by the way.
Fatigue.
Yeah, there's much that we can probably talk about in connection with that, but
the current state, yeah.
Yeah. So
the current state.
Should we continue this next time?
Yeah.
As a part 2, or do you think we're done?
I mean,
we didn't.
I really enjoyed the discussion. I would like to have you over again. It's
Sure.
wonderful talking to you.
What do you think, Adam? You were about to say something.
No, yeah, because we didn't talk about the conquest much, but it was good. But the preamble is important because first of all,
Okay.
I also wanted to convey a healthy respect for you guys too, because it's really good to see. This is what you guys like. You have a healthy respect for the phenomenology of religion. Like, I mean, I saw your mom on too, by the way. So it's very interesting. Like, it's not an angry show. Like it's not a bitter. It's not.
Yeah,
like
I guess what you're saying
bitterness.
is like a lot of what you see is people are angry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that should be part of somebody's philosophy, is whether you're angry or not, or what you should do instead.
Well, I don't want maybe to put too much emphasis on it, but I think, and maybe that's a kind of a bias, but I think the younger you are, the closer you are to leaving the religion, the more angry you're probably going to be.
Yeah. It's been 15 years for me, so.
And so that for us, I mean, for the three of us, I would say that is not something that you're probably going to see. But I have encountered people from both sides online that have heightened emotions because they're probably too close to the actual event of leaving the religion, or having just been crossing that threshold. And so, but again,
Okay,
that's
so I recommend that we do this again next week, part 2. We focus more on the conquest, and we let Anam lead the discussion because I think we derailed him too much on this one. And
I
you're
think it
going
was
to
a
be here,
very,
right?
it was a jovial, yes, sir. It was a jovial 3-way discussion, and I always.
Cool.
So thank you both for having me, and I'll see you next
right.
week. And
We'll
nice
see you next
talking to
week, and we're going to go ahead and end it here, everyone. And Osama and I are going to have a little meeting.